today's presentation, Breaking the Ice Age, Texas during the late Pleistocene. I'm Doug. I'm a volunteer here at the museum. I specialize in the Cenozoic, or the age of mammals. And so today I'm going to be walking you through some of the animals that lived in Texas during the Ice Age, whose fossils you can see in the case behind me. So when people hear the word Ice Age, they're thinking of the Pleistocene epoch. That lasted from 2.6 million to 11,000 years ago. And it's referred to as the Ice Age, but there wasn't just one Ice Age. It was a cycle of warm interglacial periods and cold ice ages. There are actually 23 distinct ice ages throughout the Pleistocene. And we're talking about the latest one that lasted from 72,000 to 11,000 years ago, and that's usually what people refer to when they say the Ice Age is the last one. The Texas coastline was different during the Pleistocene. During the Ice Ages, when you had all that water locked up in the polar ice caps, sea levels were low. So as you can see on the left there, the coastline extended much further out than it did today. And then as the ice caps melted, sea levels rose, it sunk underwater, and then the Gulf Islands that we know of today formed. Now when people hear Ice Age, this is what they think. Ice, snowbound wasteland, just devoid of any life or whatever. Now this was only true for far northern places like Canada, Scandinavia, Russia. For much of the rest of the world, it was pretty much like it is today, just a few degrees cooler, a little wetter. If this picture here looks familiar, this is what the Panhandle would have looked like during the last Ice Age. That's where a lot of our fossils of the Acacia came from. The only thing different is the more exotic animal life. So one animal you might not associate with Texas is giant tortoises. These are a good example of that alternating climate cycle. Some of these interglacial periods. Some of these interglacial periods got warm enough that allowed these giant tortoises to come up into Texas. Now, one of the more common animals that we find from the Ice Age are mammoths. This is probably because of how big they are. Their big bones are harder to break up, so they survive better. Now, woolly mammoths are icons. Now, woolly mammoths are icons of the Ice Age, but we're far too south for woolly mammoths. Instead, we had what are called Columbian mammoths.
Which are way bigger.
On the right there is a specimen known as Ellie Mae that was found up in Italy, and it's on display at the Perot Museum. Although, of course, you can't talk about mammoths in Texas without mentioning Waco Mammoth National Monument. This was a site where multiple mammoths were buried, including a nursery herd. And that nursery herd showed that, like modern elephants, mammoths were matriarchal. They lived in female-only herds when they're young. Of course, mammoths weren't the only elephants that we had living here during the Ice Age. We also had mastodons. Now, what's the difference between a mammoth and a mastodon? Well, mastodons tended to be shorter and stockier than mammoths, who were more taller and gracile. The biggest difference is in their teeth. Mastodons were browsers, so they had these tall, pointy teeth for mashing leaves and twigs, whereas mammoths had flat, rich teeth for grinding grass. Being browsers, they're would have lived in more kind of woodland and forest type environments, so they're more common in the eastern and southern parts of the state, more forested, as opposed to the west and northern parts, which are more prairie-like. Now, one of the more unusual members of the Texas megafauna are these creatures called glyptodons. Now, if it looks like an armadillo, that's no coincidence, as they are related. It's just that instead of the flexible bands, their armor fused into one solid shell, and they're a lot bigger than armadillos. They can grow up to the size of a Volkswagen, and so if you think running over an armadillo is bad, imagine driving down the road and seeing this thing meandering across. Don't think your car, I was about to say, don't think your car would survive. Glyptodons were immigrants from South America, and this is another immigrant from South America, the ground sloth. Now, we actually had several The most common is Harlan's ground sloth. Is typically more of a grazer, which might explain why it's more common here in Texas, given all the prairie and savanna that we have. We also had Jefferson's ground sloth. Now this guy was a browser, so he would have lived in the more forested parts of the state. Fun fact, he's named after Thomas Jefferson, our third president, because he was actually an avid naturalist and had an interest in fossils. And he found some of the first fossils of this animal and described them as belonging to a giant lion. And then we later found that they were related to ground sloths. And so because of that, they named the animal after him. And then finally, we had the giant ground sloth. Now, a lot of ground sloths are labeled giant ground sloth, but only a couple of them truly lived up to the title. One of them was this guy here called Eremitherium. As you can see in the image there, he could stand 13 feet tall on his hind legs. He would have weighed as much as an elephant. And he had claws over a foot long. He seems to have preferred more subtropical climates, so he was restricted down along the Gulf Coast. We had a couple different kinds of horses living in Texas during the Ice Age. We had Scott's horse, Equus scotti, and then we also had another one called Harrington Hippus. Now, horses actually originated here in North America 50 million years ago and survived until about 11,000 years ago, until the Spanish reintroduced them 500 years ago. And the interesting thing about Harrington Hippus, the guy on the left there, is that it was actually named on the basis of DNA. You know, it looked so much like other horse species that we thought it was those horse species, but then they were able to pull DNA out of it and found, nope, it's actually this completely different type of horse. Another animal you might not commonly associate with Texas are camels. Now, like horses, camels originated here in North America and then spread out elsewhere, as the land bridges opened up. It's depicted with a hump. We don't know if it had a hump, since the hump is made of fat and that doesn't fossilize. It's thought unlikely, as the hump is an adaptation to living in extreme environments. Based on the environments we know from the Ice Age, it probably wouldn't have needed a hump. It's fairly common.
We have a lot of camel and horse teeth that we found on the beach.
It's fairly common. Found all over the place, including this very nice specimen at Waco Mammoth. And not just camels, we also had llamas, specifically the large-headed llama. Again, it's an animal you associate with South America, but they originated in North America and didn't migrate to South America until 3 million years ago. And we also had giant bison. Now, your standard bison today can grow to 6 feet at the hump and weigh 2,000 pounds. It's already a big animal. Except the giant bison here has been estimated to grow 8 feet at the hump and weigh 3,000 pounds, with horns over 7 feet across. Just an absolutely massive animal. And I don't have the image with me right now, but one expert argued that it probably didn't look like a modern bison. It wouldn't have had the ruff and a couple other things. And his depiction actually looked more like a longhorn than your standard bison. So what was hunting all these animals? Big predators, of course. The most famous is Smilodon, the so-called saber cat, or sometimes called saber-toothed tiger. And it's best known from the La Brea tar pits in California, but it's actually been found at several sites here in Texas. In fact, this skull here was found in Bee County. It's held at the Smithsonian. And it's the best Smilodon skull I've seen outside of Breccia.
Where's Bee County?
That's down south along the Gulf Coast.
Beeville. Oh, Beeville, okay.
Beeville or north of Corpus Christi, I think.
Yeah.
So we actually got some pretty good Smilodon fossils here in Texas. Now, Smilodon gets all the press, but he wasn't the only long-toothed cat living here in Texas. We also had what's called the scimitar cat. And we actually have here in Texas the best site for the scimitar cat. It's a site called Frischenhahn Cave. And in that cave, we not only found multiple individuals of scimitar cat, but we found kittens.
Oh.
And so the kittens, combined with the remains of young mammoth and mastodon, suggest that the cave was being used as a denning site where the animals came to feed and rear their young. Another of our great Ice Age predators are dire wolves. Now they were originally considered wolves, a species of wolf, but like that horse I mentioned earlier, DNA shows it's actually a completely different animal. And so that's why in this reconstruction you can see here it's more of a typical wild dog rather than a wolf. It's because we now know that it's a separate lineage, something completely different. And I don't know about elsewhere, but I do know that at least some fossils of this animal were found in, if you've heard of it, Inner Space Cavern. It's down south on the I-35. Now lions. We had lions here in North America. The American lion was bigger than the African lion. Did it live in pride like the African lion? Right now the evidence suggests no. It was probably more like a tiger living by itself, coming together only to breed. Another South American animal that we had living here in Texas was the jaguar. Jaguars used to range all over North America. They're actually slightly larger than the modern variety. And then the largest predator of the Ice Age was the short-faced bear. Now this was one of the largest carnivorous mammals that's ever lived. It could stand 13 feet tall on its hind legs and weigh over 2,000 pounds. And its diet seems to have varied widely. There are some specimens that chemical analysis show were almost exclusively meat eaters. And then others were kind of a more mixed diet like you would expect from a bear. And it's hypothesized that it may have also been what we call a kleptoparasite, where it would steal kills from other predators, like grizzlies do to wolves in Yellowstone today. And we actually have an arm bone of this bear in our case here. So we're very fortunate to have that.
How large is this bear compared to a polar bear? Bigger than a polar bear?
Well, I'll get to questions at the end.
Oh, sorry about that.
It's all right. And then so finally, bison. I kind of left these guys at the end for a reason. Now bison are considered icons in the American West, but they're relative newcomers. They migrated over from Asia just 200,000 years ago. And they seem to have done very good for themselves because they quickly became the most common large mammal of the Ice Age. But the ancestral bison was larger and more robust than the modern species. And you can see that again in our exhibit with the foot bones compared with modern bison foot bones. But there's one more thing about bison, though, kind of something unusual. And that's they are one of the few large animals to survive the extinction at the end of the Pleistocene about 11,000 years ago. And so basically, bison, elk, moose, cougars, these are the only large animals who survived when all the mammoths and glyptodons and sloths and saber cats, direwolves, all that died out. These guys persevered. The last figure I heard was about North America lost 72% of its large animal life. But who else survived the Pleistocene? All the little guys. Basically, most of what we see around us today, especially the small animals, were around back then. And that's kind of the point to take home, is that what we see today isn't some next step in a progression or like the next step of evolution or whatever. It's simply what's left over. It's just the stuff that made it through that mass die-off at the end of the Pleistocene.
Horny toads are having trouble now.
Now, yeah. So what is the future of the Ice Age? Well, certainly we haven't found everything. This is a mammoth skull that was discovered in 2017 in Italy, not far from where that Ellie Mae specimen was discovered. It's recently been donated to the museum, and we're just waiting for a good opportunity to go out and dig it up.
Oh, really?
Yeah, to go and dig it up because it's massive, so it's going to take some doing to get out. There's that. We have a cave down in Uvalde that we sometimes work, where we found lots of fossils of those little critters. You can see a few of those on display in our case. You know, and then Mr. DeBry here has donated stuff that he's found up in the Panhandle. So there's obviously still a lot of stuff to find. And if you ever find something, you know, bring it in. We'll be happy to identify it for you. And so that's basically, you know, a rundown of the Ice Age here in Texas. And so if you've got any questions, come on up. I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you. There you go.
Okay.
What about the size of that bear compared to one of the white
Yeah,
polar
like a
bears,
polar bear.
which is bigger than the grizzly?
Yeah, because the polar bears,
They're like 9,
Like-
10, I don't know, they're big.
they're big, but I think, you know, the record, and that's the record for a polar bear is 12 feet tall and 2,000 pounds. But like I said, that's like the record. You know, on average, they're a bit smaller than that. Whereas, like I said, you know, the short-faced bear, you know, could be over, you know, 2,000 pounds. You know, good 13-foot tall. Is like. Like this skeleton here is about this tall at the shoulder.
Okay.